The Collaborating Conversation podcast is for avid book readers, book lovers, and authors. Listen to this podcast as we talk more about the art of writing, stories behind books, and the hands that created them. So stay tuned and enjoy our show.
Welcome to the Collaborating Conversations podcast. Today's episode is part 2 of a discussion on the singularity in sci-fi. Like, if you look at the progression of technology, I think by 2300, when you get into like the actual time frame that the expanse takes place in, I do agree with you. I think we're going to be well past the point of automation.
As in, like, we'll have automation, or as in we've automated everything.
Yeah, I mean, like, to the point where like one person will be able to control a starship, and it won't even be like, they'll just be there, in case something goes wrong, right? Like, it'll be primarily automated.
You'll be the homer who just sits in the nuclear reactor and make sure nothing happens.
Yeah. Like, I think, because I think we're not too far off from that, right? Like, I think if you look at what they're able to accomplish with SpaceX, right? Like, oh yeah, a lot of that the launching and landing of rockets is automated, and you have like a command center standing by, in case something goes wrong. But,
well, just mostly depressing
plays a heavy part in that already today. And we're not even, we're not even in 2050, right?
Well, and I see
I think it's realistic to say, in the next 100 years, the whole concept of space flight will be automated.
Yep. Well, and I don't see my biggest reason for that philosophy is I don't see human minds accepting the cost of human treachery in space, because it's going to be a small trickle. But as rocket boosters and all this stuff, the cost drop. I do see more and more people going up there, but I don't see it for work. Why would you send, a massive starship to Ceres to do ice hauling with, 100 people on it to grab the ice when that can be fully automated? Because also, where if you look at growth of technology and, how things get better, I really love watching 2-minute papers on YouTube. And his biggest thing is it's not about the paper now, it's about 2 papers down the line and the exponential growth. This is where humans really stink at exponential growth. If we, Moore's law is that chipsets double every 2 years, give or take. And that's for raw silicon and processing power, which has been true. We're kind of starting to reach a capacity to some extent, but we're not truly there. And I think that could be, I don't know if there's a law or some type of scientific thing. I think the same thing could be said for software and abilities, right? Because if you look at a Raspberry Pi and even some of the basic vision stuff you can get done now, fully automated. I mean, look at the Mars rover. That thing lands itself. Because of the delayed and lag, it lands itself. No one's piloting the Mars rover. Anything we send to the Mars, it's all automated. And I don't.
Yeah. So kind of switching gears a little bit, because since we talked about the expanse, like getting into the concept of AI a little bit more and the singularity, like what do we consider the protomolecule, right? Like, is that artificial intelligence? Like, what are people's thoughts?
I think it's a very complicated virus that is meant to take over and build I forget the terminology, essentially the Stargates. What was it actually called? Ring worlds or the ring?
The rings, yeah.
It's a very complicated piece of software, right? Because it needs organic matter and a basic building block to create it. But look what happened when they threw it into Venus, right? The tower still sprouted out of it. So it's intelligent, but is it artificial intelligence and doesn't have consciousness? To be fair, I don't think we know enough. I think it's a little bit more like when I forget the exact portion, like when it comes to the station, it talks to Holland, or talks to, what's the main character's name? Shoot, totally failing. Holden. It talks to Holden, right? But it talks to him through the cop dude, right?
Yeah, it hijacks a human consciousness, the remnants of a human consciousness to mimic the personality and behavior of that in order to accomplish a goal.
Yeah. But it uses that because it pulled the data from the organic matter that it used to build itself, correct?
Right.
Yeah. So I would argue it's a very complicated virus. And if we look at like cybersecurity and all that stuff, the complexity of viruses over the years has been exponential growth. Like look at Stuxnet, how it was able to sneak into the what do they call them? The rotating things. Wow, words are hard. Oh man, I can't remember
the nuclear containment.
No, the centrifuges that were used to spin up the uranium, and they were able to tell the controllers, "Hey, we're fine." Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. I mean, is that not what the Expanse, like the protomolecule, did? It literally went into the world and pulled organic matter, and then like, "Hey."
But I guess in that instance, though, it's only a virus to us. It's not a virus from the ring builders, right? Because they use the protomolecule throughout their society, as we see in, later books and in later series, where, they use the protomolecule technology to build ships, to advance their species, to, modify planets, to make it more, habitable, or, and ultimately, and they hint at this towards the end of the series. The ring builders' whole thing was they wanted to unite. They wanted to unite all consciousness and thought, right? And so, if you look at, I think the thing that was missing, so the protomolecule was doing that, right? So it would break down people and it would have, all their voices, but there was no central server for it to connect up to propagate across the entire species, right? And they tried to reboot that in the last book, right? Spoilers.
I haven't read it yet. No spoilers.
But I mean, well, you're kind of late. But
spoil it. Yeah. Spoiler alert! Spoiler alert! Close your ears.
La la la.
But it's hinted at. They try to reboot that whole thing, right? And they end up not, I won't spoil that part. But I mean, that was their whole thing, right? And so the protomolecule was doing what it was intended to do, and all those voices were supposed to be connected up, into the central consciousness, right? And so all those individual voices would still have their individuality, and then would become, part of the collective whole, right? And so it's interesting because I think, I think there's, I would classify as a systems intelligence, right? I'm going back to the Founder series. It's not fully AI, but it is, it is mostly there, to carry out a specific function, right? And once it carries out that function, it has no desire to do more. It just carries out that function. That's what it's made to do. And that was the whole premise behind system intelligences, is they are systems that have, a level of intelligence necessary to do some advanced function or capability, and do everything necessary to do that capability, whether it be, spin up, more resources, or, do whatever they need to do. But, at the end of the day, it just performs its function. And once it performs its function, it has no desire for more.
Well, and I think that's an interesting discussion point about where we are right now, where right now I don't think we've reached true artificial intelligence or AI or sentient form, but we do have individual different artificial intelligence functions, right? So, Tesla self-driving is a self-driving artificial intelligence to some extent. I'm not saying it's full in there, but that's the goal, right? Same with Super Cruise and all the other companies. But it's a very specified level of intelligence. Same with, I think it was Lambda. Same with DALL-E 2, right? DALL-E 2 is a specific open source machine learning thing that generates photos based off your intelligence thing. Now, one thing with their project is they want to keep open. They want to make sure AI development is safe. So in their development of the artificial intelligence, or in the neural net, I think it was which that gets into a whole can of worms of neural nets versus AI and what's the difference. And that's a whole can of technological worms that I don't fully understand and don't really care as long as the technology works. But I thought it was very interesting how they purposely didn't have any violence. There's no blood and gore. There's no thing, because they don't want AI to go down the path of being bad. But it's very interesting because there's some cool photos where you just type something in and then a photo of what you typed will come out, and it's fantastic. But then that destroys arts, right? Does that mean it's only an artwork if a human makes it, or can it still be an artwork if a machine makes it? Does the source matter when things are created?
There was a really good short. I don't know if it was Love, Death, and Robots or where it came from, but it was about this legendary artist. It was in the far future, and there was this legendary artist who created these really mind-bending art pieces. And his art pieces were not traditional art. He's just this world-renowned artist, who's like highly regarded and very wealthy. And like it comes to the premise of like, he started out as a pool cleaning robot. This is a pool cleaning robot,
and then he made that just a blue square.
Progressed and developed, over the years, just based off of like being added onto, enhanced, and stuff like that. Until it becomes like this artificial human, that people actually forget its origins and just think it's a human, and then at the end of its life, it decides that it just wants to go back to being a pool cleaning robot, and like its final. Its final reveal as like its final art project is just this pool, and like it sheds and reverts back into like this pool cleaning robot and just goes back to an existence of cleaning a pool. It's a very like existential video that is super trippy.
I totally did not connect that as like existential, but yeah, that's Love, Death, and Robots. I forget which episode, but that's an excellent series.
I think it's existential from the perspective of, if you have this machine that develops full sentience, but then at the end of its immortal life, it decides, I just want to go back to being a simple pool cleaning robot, right? Like, what does that mean for us as humanity? Right? It's like we view sentience as being like, the most important thing because we are it. But, is it, and we have people in society who are this way, right? Like, you have people who, go to the highest ranks of society, high, extensive knowledge work fields. And then they're at the end of the day, just like, yeah, I'm just going to go back to, doing something simple because I don't want to do this anymore. Right. Like, there are definitely people in our society who are like that, where they're just like, yeah, I don't want to play this game anymore. I just want to go back to living a simple life.
Well, that was one of the reasons why I left the Bay Area, was because it's like, this is like, don't get me wrong, the technology and the conversations were so cool, but it's just so like, one, expensive, and two, just you're always chasing the next thing. That's what I love about where I'm at now. It's, you can just enjoy life, and I don't want to say live in the moment, because I think there's times for that, but also time to plan for the future, also reflect on the past, not to get too philosophical there. But yeah, and it's interesting, like, because I kind of had that thing where I changed career fields to a different career field because the one I chose wasn't fulfilling enough. And I think that is one of the cool things as humans right now, is we get to choose and we get that, right? Versus, one could argue, oh, he was a pool cleaning robot, so was that just in his programming? Like, even though he's an artificial intelligence, but was he just programmed so that's the only thing that would, air quotes, get him fulfillment? But then we always ask the same thing, right? It's a fundamental philosophical question of human nature is, are we just programmed by our biology? Are we subject to just biological whims? Or is there like a greater purpose in the world? And do we serve a greater, whatever? And it definitely is an interesting question. And I think that's also one of the things where like, will artificial intelligence and will people try to solve that problem or solve those questions? That's where, totally off topic, but I loved the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, but in that one, they built the supercomputer to find the meaning of life, to answer the question, right? They developed something to answer the question. So that will also be, kind of a switching gears. Will artificial intelligence be used to like find, human purpose or whatnot? Or like, there's this certain dystopias, or was it Futurama that's like, you're going to be good at this job, so here's what you have to do the rest of your life.
Yeah, they had this selection. Yeah.
Right. And will that affect actually people and type of thing? Like, will AI become so good that it can just understand our personalities instantly and be like, I think you should do this. It's like, I'm going to rebel and do this. Like, haha, I knew you were going to do that. And that's actually what I want you to do.
Yeah. One area we haven't talked about, maybe, I don't know, Max, if you read the Bobiverse books, but maybe let's talk about, spend some time talking about that whole, and I think we can probably tie in maybe the Bobiverse with some other series that play with that concept of, going from a human to being a machine, and like, what is sentience, what is consciousness? So maybe, Justin, you give us quick context on the Bobiverse for maybe people who aren't familiar with it.
Yeah, I'm going to try not to spoil it because it's in my mind, one of the best pieces of science fiction out there. So the concept is a von Neumann probe, and I totally combobulated that, but essentially a self-replicating probe that goes out to space and kind of creates more copies of it. So in the Bobiverse, he starts off life as a human, and then in the first chapter, not a spoiler, in the first chapter, he dies. and his consciousness gets thrown into a virtual machine that's running essentially in a cube. And then throughout the book, he goes through the existential life crisis of like, am I human or am I alive? Am I this? Am I that? What makes human? You know, but it's a great story. It asks those questions, the fundamental questions, you know, because I think that's something, I forget which project it is, but there are current projects that are trying to and want to be able to copy the mind of a human into a computer, right? Because that's one way to live hypothetically immortality, because it's just, you know, the neurons and everything. So if you can build a copy of that neurological structure, will you, you know, is that still you? And is that, you know, is it you or is it a copy? And then if you link soul to that and other stuff. And so it answers those questions, but it also does that in a very fun science fiction way, and just a very explorative. And it's one of my favorite series ever. I don't want to go too much into it because if you haven't read it, everyone should read it. It's a fantastic space opera and self-replicating. And, you know, it's also interesting because, like, you know, there's only one of us here is a father. And so, you know, our kids the closest we get to self-replicating, but it's not a true copy of our consciousness, right? We have to train those kids and imprint some of our consciousness on them, but only in our values and other stuff, right? But if you could make an exact copy of yourself, is it still you? I mean, this was the whole Star Trek replicator problem or teleporter problem, right? Because essentially when you Star Trek, you were disassembled at a molecular level and then reassembled. Are you the same person or are you a copy? Which I don't think anyone's ever came up to a full conclusion, right?
I think it kind of, I think if you look at it from the Star Trek lore, they believe it's the same consciousness. But, you are being recreated. And so I think it kind of plays, I think another book that kind of explores this as well is Fall by Neil Stephenson, which came out a few years ago. But I think they take two different approaches, right? Because I think Bobiverse focuses on, that consciousnthat is that person. There can only be one consciousness of you. And, if that if you replicate what was that consciousness, it becomes someone different. But it, and it gets into like that drift, right? Like, exact copy, but different personality.
Well, so that's the Altered Carbon also talks about this. So since the series has been out a few years, I'm okay with, there's kind of a spoiler at the end, but that the Altered Carbon says the same thing, right? You have a copy of your stack and then you put it into two sleeves, but from that moment you have a split, right? So it's, to some extent, it's the multiverse theory of your split. So from that moment on, you have the same base code, but then how you interact and what happens in your life changes can affect your personality are interesting, right? Now, which book were you saying that was doing that as well?
So Fall took a different approach, because Fall was the one where basically when someone dies, their connectome gets scanned and they get uploaded. But, they established very quickly in the book that when these connectome scans happen, when the person dies, it's not the person that gets resurrected in this new universe. It's something like the person, and so I think, Neil Stephenson takes that approach that, it is not you.
It's just a copy of your neurons.
It is something like you. That has your experiences, but basically starts a second life as something different, right? And so it was a completely different take on that.
Looking for an exciting space adventure book, a romantic young adult story, and a fantastic sci-fi read? Get The Fondra by award-winning author Emmanuel M. Arriaga today and prepare to feed your imagination with never-ending thrill ride.
There was another book, I'm trying to come up with the name of it, but the premise in the book was, you had the progression of technology to a point where, you could send off a copy of yourself. Actually, I think the book is called The Singularity, funny enough. You could send off a copy of yourself into the digital sphere, and that consciousness of yourself could go off and learn and have its own lived experiences, but then it would come back and then sync with you. Right. And so, you had the human who was, the original, person. And then you kind of send off, a copy of yourself to go do some task. And so it was a way, it basically implemented like true multitasking, right? Because it's just like, hey, I'm going to make a replica of myself digitally I'm going to assign to a task, and that replica will go off and do that task and then come back to me. And then I will absorb the information that replica, experienced. And then now the two of us will become one, and we'll have, that
the best way to go to college. Just go to college in a digital, because think about it, right? If it's digital, you can go 24/7 and you don't have to deal with cycles. And then it's basically matrix the information back to your head, right?
Accelerando. So the name of the book is Accelerando.
Okay.
And one of the things that happens, so the whole premise of that book is to get to the singularity, and they do. But it kind of talks about the progress of humanity, and so it gets to the singularity, and then what happens once we get to the singularity. But one of the interesting things, right, is, at one point in the book, there's this character who is the daughter of, the original main character, and this is, many years later, and she creates a digital copy of herself and puts it on a spaceship, right, and sends that spaceship off, on a journey. And so you have this spaceship that's completely automated, that's manned by these digital replicas of humans, right? But there's no actual humans on the ship. And so that ship goes off, it goes to the galactic edge, it goes to the edge, the far edge, they basically discover a network terminal in space, and so it's just like, oh, maybe there's aliens, we've discovered what appears to be like a network link to connect with like this broader galactic network, right? And so they send the ship off to go connect with that network, right? And the human leaves the human body, Earth, right? And so, this trip ends up taking, like over 100 years or whatever, 100 or 200 years, right? And so when the machine returns, the physical form of the woman, right, had, she had actually, died. And it was interesting because they, at that stage, I think death was an optional thing, because it was, people, they had found a way, to extend human life. But what ended up happening was, her physical form had become bankrupt because of, a whole bunch of lawsuits and other things and stuff, and debt that they amassed. And so like they died destitute. And then when the artificial intelligence version of her gets back, they try to hit the artificial intelligence with all the back debt that the human accrued, in their lifetime. And the artificial intelligence is like, whoa, wait a minute. And they're just like, well, you're her, but like, they had split, right? And so like one went off and lived this, journey to the galactic edge, and they brought back like a digital alien, right? and like the digital consciousness of an alien, right? And so it was very interesting, right? Because it's just like this artificial intelligence was now being hit with the mistakes of their human body, even though they considered that human body, that person, a different person, and they actually resented the decisions that the human person made, right? And then it becomes later in the story where, the artificial intelligence gets an artificial shell, right? To have like that human body experience. But it plays around with that concept of like, creating a digital version of yourself, like who, like, you have those different consciousness, right? And like they're different people, but then they consolidate. But then what happens when that initial version of you is no longer around, right? And so it's an interesting book, but I think it plays in with like that concept of, what happens when a human digitizes, are they the same person? And I think a number of authors have explored this in different ways. And I know the Bobiverse approach to this is, I think in the later books, they talk about, like quantum theory, where your consciousness is a singular quantum state, that it persists over, independent of your existing shell, right? So like if you transfer your consciousness from one location to another and shut down the previous body of your consciousness shifts. You remain the same person, right? Like that was one of the things that the Bobiverse establishes, right? Like as long as you turn off your prior body, your consciousness, that quantum state of your consciousness does transfer, which I think is an interesting concept. I think it's a way to try to, introduce,
well, the author was taking it to a very interesting place, and hypothesizing, what's it called? Simulation theory. But I think it's also very interesting how the laws are going to have to change. And we already know laws don't keep up with this, right? Like, the first person who digitizes, like, are they going to be able to keep all their rights? Are they going to be able to have access to their bank accounts? Are they going to have access to all their wealth? But then how do you deal with like generational wealth or something where someone lives 1,000 years digitized, and because, they're not spending as much money or whatever, their bank account's just constantly growing because of compound interest, right? Because in human scale, compound interest is decent. But then, if you start off with like $20,000 and then don't spend anything and you compound interest for 1,000 years, right? But to some extent, I think
Futurama played around with this, right? Like Fry had, like $100 in his bank account or something like that, right? And over the course of, I don't even think it was $100, but over the course of like the thousands of years, he ends up being like a multi-billionaire, right?
Wasn't inflation so bad?
He just had his bank account persisted, right? And he accesses it thousands of years later, and he's just like, hey, all right, Fry, you're a billionaire now, right? And he's just like, what?
Well, but wasn't inflation so bad that it was still worth only like $100 or something? I forget what they were doing on that one.
But yeah, I think it kind of speaks to the, the concepts we've talked about before with like, altered carbon and stuff like that, where, if you add that time scale aspect, and I think they talk about that in the Bobbiverse too, right? The moment the time scale changes, right, where time is no longer a limiting factor for humanity, when the time scale changes, like the whole part of existence shifts, right? Because, the Bobs start thinking of, non-Bobs as ephemerals, right? Because it's just like, your lifespan is 60 to 80 years, right? Like that's a drop in the bucket for me because I'm going to exist forever, unforeseen, some kind of war act or destruction mistake, unforeseen, right? And so I think it's just, I think many different series play with this, and I also play with it in Foundry, right, where you have the immortals, and that time scale. The moment you add immortality into that mix, like it just changes the perspective for everything. And I think from the going back to AI, and maybe this is a note to end on, what is, do we think that, time is something that distinguishes like humanity from, artificial intelligence or sentience? Like, is it human that we live and die, or is it human? I think you can look at the religious aspect of it, but like, is it human, to be finite in, today, or is that irrelevant?
Right. Or like in the future, because they have all the technology, dying becomes archaic. And it's like, why wouldn't you want to live forever? Because that's just the cultural norm versus like us, where I don't want to live more than like 200 years. Like, I don't think I'd want to live more than 200 years. It's difficult enough living like my, X amount now. It's already been hard enough. But I do think one of the things that I like about that is, because I've been thinking about it in the scope of politics and business and stuff. Right now, everyone's thinking in such short terms. And, our presidency, and again, not to get super into politics, our presidency is 2 terms or 8 years, which isn't really a lot, but it also is a lot. You can do a lot in 4 years or 8 years, but is there a benefit to having someone thinking long-term of the country, right? Or long-term, thinking long-term? Because I think that's one of the human problems, because until you get older, due to relativity, a year is barely anything of your life when you're young. It's 1/10 when you're like, 10, 1/20th when you're 20, and 1/30th when you're 30. And as you get older, a year becomes less and less time. But I think we somehow lose track of that time and lose track of long-term planning and thinking. And I think that'd be interesting if like you had an AI or something dedicated to like, actually, the decisions you're making now are going to be like super terrible for your grandkids or like your future kids, like I'm pretty sure if we knew about global warming or, climate change or all this stuff, like when everyone was doing it, would that still, if you knew about that, would all the industry and all the things happen, or would more time and energy been put into, clean stuff? And I don't know. It's an interesting thought experiment, but also just being able to think long-term, I think, is a very beneficial mindset that currently isn't always employed.
I think they're separate in a way. It is human to live and die. I feel like that's the beauty of life, right? You're racing against the clock, except you don't really know how much time is left, right? And you have to sort of make the most of it, or maybe you don't. Everybody has their own philosophy. In a context of AI, even though, yes, we're looking at intelligence in a human versus intelligence in a machine and what are the differences and so on and so forth. At the end of the day, it's a tool. It's a mean to an end. It's a tool that's there to hopefully help make our lives a little bit easier. As with most things, something has to give. There are pros and cons. While it could be meant for one thing, you could have folks use it for something totally different, which, may or may not be good. And all of a sudden I forgot where I was going with this. Oh, Lord. But yeah, I think
short-term thinking, human consciousness.
Right. So to me, it's like the beauty of a machine, right, is that it never forgets unless you just erase the hard drive and just empty everything, right? The beauty of a machine is that it never forgets. So it can get good at one thing and become really good at it, and even better than a human could ever be, right? But where we are now, it's really a test, or at least an application of memorization, because with humans, we're able to apply our intelligence in multiple contexts, right? So you learn how to play checkers, and then you go learn how to play chess. And while that's a totally different game, you're able to, take some of the things you learn in checkers and try to apply that there. Same thing, you go, and, so on and so forth. So as you're faced with challenges with a higher degree of complexity, the foundation you have from your previous experiences is something that you're able to apply, assuming you figure out a way to apply them. Machines today, at least, are not able to do that. You can you can teach them to do one thing really well, but if you say, okay, do this other thing without necessarily telling them, okay, they can't do anything they haven't been programmed for. And once that happens, that's why I think we'll have reached the singularity. And, until then, I don't know, just look at it as something that can be helpful.
Well, I think the singularity is even beyond that, right? Because I think the singularity is not just the existence of AI. The singularity is the existence of benevolent AI. Like getting to that state of absorption almost into like this in-state consciousness. One of the things in the Accelerando, for example, that book I was mentioning before, their in-state in the singularity was, they had, humanity had continued to progress to a point where, everyone gave up their mortal shell and became a digital existence, and they broke down the planets of the inner solar system into their raw elements to create more space for digital entities to exist, in this perpetual existence machine, right? Of providing energy, heat dissipation, and existence for society, right? And so like that was the end state for the singularity, and then for the people who didn't want to digitize their existence, like they put them in the far solar system and said, hey, we've made this, we've terraformed this planet for you. If you want to continue to be a meat bag, like you can exist here, in utopia, but the rest of us are going to go become, this society that exists on essentially heat dissipators and data holders, powered by the sun in the inner solar system for the rest of, our society. And it was just a really it's just like, which one would you be, right? Would you, when the singularity happens, do you want to exist as a digital entity, or do you want to stay in meatbag and have to go somewhere else because the solar system that you grew up in, that your humanity existed in for so long, no longer is hospitable for life because it's been optimized for, the expansion of civilization, which means digital civilization, right? I don't know. Maybe that's a place to end on final thoughts.
That sounds like a great topic for another time. However, yeah, I think that's a great topic. I think final thoughts are, it's a difficult question. I don't think we have an answer, but I'm excited and optimistic for the future because I think it's going to be fun. I'm hoping it's not full Terminator, but At the same time, who doesn't want to be a John Connor and who doesn't want to fight the machine, fight the power man? No. I think it's a wonderful opportunity. I think it's going to raise interesting questions, and it's going to be interesting how life changes. So I'm excited to be alive in this time, and see what the future holds. It's going to be fun.
Any final thoughts, Max?
My thoughts and prayers are with the engineers that have to come up with this technology. Gonna be a lot of sleepless nights.
And so just to close, interesting thing of the week. Who wants to go first?
So I am in Berrien Springs right now, home of Andrews University. And I used to come here in summers because I have an aunt who lives here. And I never realized that there's nothing here. For everything, literally, you have to go to Indiana. So that's my fun fact of the week. The fact that, I'm just not realizing this. And I've been here maybe a dozen times already.
So what you're saying is you've gotten used to Uber Eats and Lyft, and now there's nothing to do there.
What? So here's the thing with Uber Eats. So there's actually a delivery fee, right? So they give me this promo of I guess Uber Premium or whatever their paid program is, and there's no delivery fee. But because everything is far here, the delivery fee is still there. But I mean, this is like my second or third time as an adult, though. So I guess before I didn't really have to worry about.
Don't you miss those rose-colored glasses we had on as kids?
I know, right? It's crazy. I want to be oblivious again.
Everything was.
But yeah, that's my fun fact of the week.
So my fun fact of the week, I think, actually really applies here because it's not specifically unintended consequences, but unexpected changes. So we all are aware about the printing press and how that revolutionized knowledge transfer. But were you aware that one of the biggest unintended changes happened after that? Turns out everybody realized, I always get farsighted and nearsighted confused, but everybody figured out they needed glasses because they couldn't read the books. So it actually changed, and the glasses industry became just as big as the book industry. So I was reading How We Got to Here, or How We Got to Now. I forget the author's name. But it was a fascinating discussion how things are connected, and how I never correlated how the printing press would have required or would have pushed innovation in glasses, where as people realized they couldn't read the books.
Wait, I'm confused. So people were not buying books?
No, they were buying books, but they didn't realize they were nearsighted or farsighted. I always get those two confused, where they needed glasses to be able to actually read the letters of the book or read the book. So glasses became more popular and economically feasible as glass science became caught up with the printing press.
How were they able to make that connection, though?
No, it wasn't a connection. It was a social need, because glasses were already around at the time of the printing press. But it wasn't as common.
I misunderstood.
It wasn't as common, and it wasn't as prevalent. So costs were extremely high. Yeah, it's How We Got to Now by Stephen Jason. He talks about how the cost of glasses were high because there wasn't a lot of books and a lot of reading material, right? But the printing press caused a need for more glasses. And so mass production of glasses and glass science became better because there was an economic need for glasses, as more people started realizing they needed glasses to read the new books that came out of the printing press.
That's interesting indeed.
Right?
Yeah, it is. I'm still processing it.
I would highly recommend the book to everyone here. How We Got to Now, as it connects things that I hadn't even thought were connected before.
Cool. So my interesting thing of the week is also a book. It's actually a book called Deep Work.
I've heard of that.
And it's the tagline for it, rules for focused success in a distracted world. And this book has actually been very interesting to me because the quick synopsis is it basically talks about how we're in a knowledge world, where, we have these knowledge jobs, but a lot of our day-to-day jobs is actually favors doing shallow work, which, is actually like, checking email, the micro distractions, chats, things like that, but the skills that are highly valued in our society are deep work, but our society is over optimized towards shallow work. So it's just an interesting concept because it's right. It's like, you know, to be successful in this knowledge economy, you have to do deep work. But the things that this knowledge economy values, you know, in the day to day is shallow work. So how do you balance that, right? You know, how do you ensure that you can do deep work in a world that constantly demands shallow work from you, but actually values the deep work you do more?
So office to do that shallow work, even though you can do it all from home.
Yeah, but it's a good book. I would recommend it.
I think it's on my list.
Cool. Well, thanks, everyone. This has been another episode of the Collaborating Conversations podcast, and that's it.
We need an outro.
Thank you for listening. Check out our podcast on Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts if you enjoyed the show. For more books and inspiring stories from today's authors, please subscribe to our podcast.